Hood could see that both men were under a strain, but whatever its cause, it was mild compared to what followed presently. As the sun climbed swiftly clear of the horizon, Lee worked out a plan whereby he would extend his right down Seminary Ridge to a point beyond the enemy left, then attack northeast up the Emmitsburg Road, which ran diagonally across the intervening valley, to strike and crumple the Union flank on Cemetery Ridge. Though he said nothing of this to Longstreet, who expressed his disapproval in advance, he explained it in some detail to McLaws when he rode up shortly after 8 o'clock. "I wish you to place your division across this road," Lee told him, pointing it out on the map and on the ground. "I wish you to get there, if possible, without being seen by the enemy. Can you do it?" McLaws said he thought he could, but added that he would prefer to take a close-up look at the terrain in order to make certain. Lee replied that a staff engineer had been ordered to do just that, and I expect he is about ready. He meant that the officer was probably about ready to report, but McLaws understood him to mean that he was about ready to set out. "I will go with him," he said. Before Lee could explain, Longstreet broke in, having overheard the conversation as he paced up and down. "No, sir," he said emphatically, "I do not wish you to leave your division." As he spoke, he leaned forward and traced a line on the map perpendicular to the one Lee had indicated earlier. "I wish your division placed so," he said. Quietly, but in measured tones, Lee replied, "No, General, I wish it placed just opposite." When the embarrassed McLaws repeated that he would like to go forward for a look at the ground his division was going to occupy, Longstreet once more refused to permit it, and Lee declined to intervene further. So McLaws retired in some bewilderment to rejoin his troops and await the outcome of this unfamiliar clash of wills. Presently, the staff engineer, S.R. Johnston, returned from his early morning reconnaissance on the right, and his report was everything Lee could have hoped for. According to him, the Federals had left the southern portion of Cemetery Ridge unoccupied, along with both of the Round Tops. When Lee asked pointedly, "Did you get there?" for the information was too vital to be accepted as mere hearsay, Johnston replied that his report was based entirely on what he'd seen with his own eyes. Lee's pulse quickened. This confirmed the practicality of his plan, which was for Longstreet to launch an oblique attack up the Emmitsburg Road, get astride Cemetery Ridge, and then sweep northward along it, rolling up the Union flank in order to get at the rear of the force on Cemetery Hill, kept under pressure all this time by Ewell, who was to attack on the left, fixing the bluecoats in position and setting up for the kill as soon as he heard the guns open fire to the south. Moreover, while Lee was considering this welcome intelligence, Longstreet received a report that his reserve artillery, 8 batteries which were to lend the weight of their metal to the assault, had just arrived. It was now about 9 o'clock. Except for Pickett's division and Evander Law's brigade, on the march respectively from Chambersburg and New Guilford, the whole First Corps was at hand. Still, Lee did not issue a final order for the attack, wanting first to confer with Ewell and thus make certain that the Second Corps understood its share in the revised plan for the destruction of those people across the way. Leaving Hill and Longstreet on Seminary Ridge, he rode to Ewell's headquarters north of Gettysburg, only to find that the general was off on a tour of inspection. Trimble was there, however, serving in the capacity of a high-ranking aide and advisor, and while they waited for Ewell to return, he conducted Lee to the cupola of a nearby almshouse, which afforded a good view of the crest of Culp's and Cemetery Hills above and beyond the rooftops of the town below. Observing that the defenses of the two heights had been greatly strengthened in the course of the 16 hours that had elapsed since Ewell first declined to attack the rallying Federals there, Lee said regretfully, "The enemy have the advantage of us in a short and inside line, and we are too much extended. We did not or could not pursue our advantage of yesterday, and now the enemy are in a good position." When Ewell at last returned, Lee repeated what he told Trimble, stressing the words, "We did not or could not pursue our advantage," as if to impress Ewell with his desire that the Second Corps would neglect no such opportunity today. Though it was plain that the Union stronghold had been rendered almost impregnable to the attack from this direction, he explained his overall plan in detail, making it clear that all 3 divisions here on the left were to menace both heights as soon as Longstreet's guns began to roar, and he added that the demonstration was to be converted into a full-scale assault if events disclosed a fair chance of success. This done, he rode back toward Seminary Ridge, along whose eastern slope 2 of Hill's divisions were already posted, well south of the Chambersburg Pike. Anderson's, which had not arrived in time for a share in yesterday's fight, was farther south under orders to join Longstreet's attack as it came abreast, rolling northward, and Pender's was to do the same in turn, simultaneously extending its left to make contact with the 2nd Corps southwest of Gettysburg. Heath's division, which was in about as shaken a state as its shell-shocked commander, would remain in reserve on the far side of Willoughby Run, not to be called for except in the event of the threat of a disaster. It was just past 11 o'clock when Lee returned to Seminary Ridge, suffering en route from what an officer who rode with him called more impatience than I ever saw him exhibit upon any other occasion, and gave Longstreet orders to move out. Observing his chief's disappointment at finding the 2 1st Corps divisions still occupying the standby positions in which he'd left them 2 hours earlier, Longstreet did not presume to suggest that he wait for Pickett, as he had told Hood he preferred to do, even though this would have postponed the attack until sundown at the soonest. But he did request a half-hour delay to allow for the arrival of Law, whose brigade was reported close at hand by now. Lee agreed, although regretfully, and when Law came up shortly before noon, completing a 24-mile speed march from New Guilford in less than 9 hours, the 2 divisions lurched into motion, headed south under cover of Hare Ridge, which screened them from observation by enemy lookouts on the Round Tops. Apparently Meade had begun to rectify his neglect of those bastions, for signal flags were flapping busily from the summit of the nearer of the 2. Lee was not disturbed by this, however. Now that the march was underway, his calm and confidence were restored. Well, that was to be expected, he said, when scouts reported that the enemy left was being extended southward along Cemetery Ridge. But General Meade might as well have saved himself the trouble, for we'll have it in our possession before night. Longstreet's veterans agreed. The march was far from an easy one, the day being hot and water scarce, but they were accustomed to such hardships, which were to be endured as prelude to the delivery of the assault that would determine the outcome of the battle. Moreover, they considered it standard procedure that theirs was the corps selected for that purpose. There was a kind of intuition, an apparent settled fact, one of its members later declared, that after all the other troops had made their long marches, tugged at the flanks of the enemy, threatened his rear, and all the display of strategy and generalship had been exhausted in the dislodgement of the foe, and all these fail, then, when the hard, stubborn, decisive blow was to be struck, the troops of the 1st Corps were called on to strike it. As it turned out, however, the march was a good deal harder and longer than they or anyone else, including Lee and Longstreet, expected when they began it. The crowflight distance of 3 miles from their starting point near Lee's headquarters to their jump-off position astride the Emmitsburg Road just opposite the Round Tops would be doubled by the necessity for taking a roundabout covered route in order to stay hidden from Meade, who would be able to hurry reinforcements to any portion of his line within minutes of being warned that it was threatened. Nor was that all. This estimated distance of 6 miles had to be redoubled in turn, at least for some of the marches, when it was discovered that the movement eastward would be disclosed to the enemy if the butternut column passed over the crest of Hare Ridge here to the south, where the woods were thin. Plainly upset by this sign of the guide's incompetence, but no more so than the guide himself, a lowly captain on Lee's staff who had neither sought nor wanted the assignment, who had not reconnoitered west of Seminary Ridge at all, and who later protested that he had no idea that I had the confidence of the great General Lee to such an extent that he would entrust me with the conduct of an Army Corps moving within 2 miles of the enemy line. Longstreet halted the column and reversed its direction of march back northward to a point near the Chambersburg Pike again, where the ridge could be crossed under cover of heavy woods. Some time was saved by giving the lead to Hood, who had followed McLaws till then, but nearly 2 full hours had been wasted in marching and counter-marching, only to return to their approximate starting point. Longstreet's anger soon gave way to sadness. A soldier who watched him ride past, his eyes cast to the ground as if in deep study, his mind disturbed, recorded afterwards that old Peter today had more the look of gloom than he'd ever seen him wear before. Southward the march continued under cover of McPherson's Ridge, then around its lower end, eastward across Pitz's Run and through the woods to Seminary Ridge, which here approached the Emmitsburg Road at the point desired. The head of the column, Law's brigade, which by now had spent 12 blistering hours on the march, got there shortly after 3 o'clock. This was not bad time for the distance hiked, but the better part of another hour would be required to mass the two divisions for attack. Worst of all, as Hood's men filed in on the far right, confronting the rocky loom of Little Round Top, they saw bluecoats clustered thickly in a peach orchard, half a mile to the north, roughly that same distance in advance of the main Federal line on Cemetery Ridge, and directly across the road from the position McLaws had been assigned. This came as a considerable surprise. They were not supposed to be there at all, or at any rate their presence was not something that had been covered by Lee's instructions. Neither was their presence in the orchard covered by any instructions from their own commander. In fact, at the time Hood's men first spotted them, Meade did not even know they were there, but supposed instead that they were still back on the ridge in the position he had assigned to them that morning. Since 9 o'clock, 6 hours ago, and within 6 hours of his arrival, his dispositions for defense had been virtually complete. Slocum's two divisions, reunited by shifting Geary north from Little Round Top, occupied the southeast extremity of Culp's Hill, while Wadsworth's 1st Corps division was posted on the summit and along the saddle leading west to Cemetery Hill. There, Howard's 3 divisions held the broad plateau, supported by the other 2 divisions of the 1st Corps, now under Virginia-born John Newton, whom Meade had ordered forward from Sedgwick's Corps because he mistrusted Doubleday. Thus, 8 of the 16 available divisions were concentrated to defend the Barb and bend of the Fishhook, with Sykes's 3 in general reserve available too, if needed. South of there, along the nearly 2 miles of Shank, the 5 divisions under Hancock and Sickles extended the line down Cemetery Ridge to the vicinity of Little Round Top, though the height itself remained unoccupied after Geary's early morning departure. Buford's cavalry guarded the left flank, Gregg's the right, and Kilpatrick's the rear, coming west from Hanover. Meade had established headquarters in a small house beside the Tawnytown Road, half a mile south of Cemetery Hill, and thus near the center of his curved 3-mile line. Here, once the posting of his men and guns had been completed, he busied himself with attempts to divine his opponent's intentions. With Ewell's 3 divisions in more or less plain view to the north, he expected the rebel attack to come from that direction, and he had massed his troops accordingly. However, as the sun climbed swiftly up the sky, the apparent inactivity of the other 2 enemy corps disturbed him, knowing as he did that Lee was seldom one to bide his time. It seemed to him that the Virginian must have something up his sleeve, something as violent and bloody no doubt as Chancellorsville, where Hooker had been unhorsed, and the more he considered this possibility, the less he liked the present look of things. At 9:30, thinking perhaps the proper move would be to beat his old friend to the punch, he asked Slocum to report from Culp's Hill on the practicability of attacking the enemy in that quarter. When Slocum replied an hour later that the terrain on the right, though excellent for defense, was not favorable for attack, Meade abandoned the notion of taking the offensive when Sedgwick arrived. In point of fact, he already had his chief of staff at work in the low-ceilinged garret of his headquarters cottage, preparing an order for retirement. Not that he meant to use it unless he had to, he explained later, but with so large a portion of Lee's army on the prowl, or at any rate out of sight, he thought it best to be prepared for almost anything, including a sudden necessity for retreat. At 3 o'clock, still with no substantial information as to his adversary's intentions, he wrote Halleck that he had his army in a strong position for defensive. He was hoping to attack, he said, but if I find it hazardous to do so, or am satisfied the enemy is endeavoring to move by my rear and interpose between me and Washington, I shall fall back to my supplies at Westminster. I feel fully the responsibility resting upon me, he added, and will endeavor to act with caution. At least one of his corps commanders, Sickles, whose 2 divisions were on the extreme left of the line, had serious reservations about the defensive strength of the position, at least so far as his own portion of it was concerned. Cemetery Ridge lost height as it extended southward until finally, just short of Little Round Top, it dwindled to comparatively low and even somewhat marshy ground. 3/4 of a mile due west, moreover, the Emmitsburg Road crossed a broad knoll which seemed to Sickles, though its crest was in fact no more than 12 feet higher than the lowest point of the ridge, to dominate the sector Meade had assigned him. The only cover out there was afforded by the scant foliage of a peach orchard in the southeast corner of the junction formed by a dirt road leading back across the ridge. Artillery from either side could bludgeon more or less at will that otherwise bald hump of earth and everything on it. But to Sickles, gazing uphill at it from his post on the low-lying far left of the army, the situation resembled the one that had obtained when his enforced abandonment of Hazel Grove caused the Union line to come unhinged at Chancellorsville, and he reasoned that the same thing would happen here at Gettysburg unless something more than skirmishes were advanced to deny the Confederates access to that dominant ground directly to his front. As the morning wore on and Meade did not arrive to inspect the dispositions on the left, Sickles sent word that he was grievously exposed. Meade, concerned exclusively with the threat to his right and having little respect anyhow for the former Tammany politician's military judgment, dismissed the warning with the remark, "Oh, generals are apt to look for the attack to be made where they are." To Sickles this sounded more than ever like Hooker, and at mid-morning he went in person to headquarters to ask if he was or was not authorized to post his troops as he thought best. "Certainly," Meade replied, "within the limits of the general instructions I've given you. Any ground within those limits you choose to occupy, I leave to you." So Sickles rode back, accompanied by Henry Hunt, whom Meade sent along to look into the complaint, and though the artillerist rather agreed that it was valid, he also pointed out the danger of establishing a salient, for that was what it would amount to, so far in advance of the main line, so open to interdictory fire, and so extensive that the available troops would have to be spread thin in order to occupy it. In short, he declined to authorize the proposed adjustment, though he promised to discuss it further with the Army commander and send back a final decision. As the sun went past the overhead and no word came from headquarters, Sickles continued to fume and fret. Learning finally that Buford's cavalry had been relieved from its duty of patrolling the left flank, which he believed exposed him to assault from that direction, he could bear it no longer. If Meade was blind to obvious portents of disaster, Sickles certainly was not. He decided to move out on his own. At 3 o'clock, while Meade was writing Halleck that his position was a strong one for defensive, the veterans of Hancock's corps, playing cards and boiling coffee along the northern half of Cemetery Ridge, taking it easy as a long hot day wore on and no attack developed, was surprised to hear drums rolling and throbbing off to the left. And when they looked in that direction, they saw Sickles' 2 divisions of better than 10,000 men advancing westward across the open fields in formal battle order, bugles blaring and flags aflutter, lines carefully dressed behind a swarm of skirmishers all across the front. "How splendidly they march," one of the watchers cried, and another remarked in round-eyed admiration, "It looks like a dress parade, a review." The movement was so deliberate, so methodical in execution, that John Gibbon, sitting his horse alongside Hancock, who had dismounted, wondered if the Second Corps had somehow failed to receive an order for a general advance. Hancock knew better. Leaning on his sword and resting one knee on the ground, he tempered his surprise with amusement at the sight of old Dan Sickles leading his soldiers to the war. "Wait a moment," he said, and he smiled grimly as he spoke. "You'll see them tumbling back." Some among Sickles' own officers were inclined to agree with this prediction, especially after they had reached and examined their new position, half a mile and more in front of the rest of the army. In ordering the maneuver, one brigadier observed, the corps commander had shown more ardor to advance and meet the fight than a nice appreciation of the means to sustain it. Old soldiers reviewing the situation down the years expressed the same thought in simpler terms when they said that Sickles stuck out like a sore thumb. Not only was there little cover or means of concealment out here on the broad, low hump of earth, there was also a half-mile gap between the extreme right of the salient and the left of Hancock's corps back on the ridge. Moreover, Hunt's theoretical objection that Sickles did not have enough troops for the operation he proposed was sustained by the fact that his new line, extending from near the Cordori house well up the Emmitsburg Road to the peach orchard, where it bent sharply back to form an angle, and then across the southwest corner of a large wheat field to end rather inconclusively in front of a mean-looking jumble of boulders known appropriately as the Devil's Den, just west of Little Round Top, was about twice the length of the mile-long stretch of ridge which now lay vacant in its rear. As a result, the position had little depth, practically no reserves or physical feature to fall back on, and was unsupported on both ends. To some it seemed an outright invitation to disaster, an impression that was strengthened considerably within half an hour of the march out by a full-scale bombardment from rebel guns across the way in the woods along the eastern slope of Seminary Ridge. Riding down at last in response to the sudden uproar, Meade was appalled to see what Sickles had improvised here on the left. "General, I'm afraid you're too far out," he said, understating the case in an attempt to keep control of his hair-trigger temper. Still in disagreement, Sickles insisted that he could maintain his position if he were given adequate support, a stipulation he had not made before. "However, I will withdraw if you wish, sir," he added. Meade shook his head as the guns continued to growl and rumble in the woods beyond the Emmitsburg Road. "I think it's too late," he said. "The enemy will not allow you." He was calculating his chances as he spoke. The situation had been greatly improved by the arrival of Sedgwick, whose 3 divisions now were filing up the Baltimore Pike across Rock Creek and onto the field, ending on schedule their long march from Manchester. They could replace Sykes in general reserve and thus free those 3 well-rested divisions to move in support of Sickles. "If you need more artillery, call on the reserve," Meade shouted above the thunder of the bombardment. "The 5th Corps and a division of Hancock's will support you." But that was as far as he got. His horse reared in terror at the roar of a nearby gun and suddenly bolted, the bit in his teeth. For a moment all Meade's attention was on the fear-crazed animal, which seemed as likely to carry him into the enemy lines as to remain within his own. But presently he got him under control again and galloped off to order up supports for Sickles and the salient. It was clear by now that they would be needed soon, for behind him, as he rode, he could hear above the uproar of the guns the unnerving quaver of the rebel yell, which signified all too clearly that Lee was launching another of those savage attacks that had won fame for him and his scarecrow infantry.